And looks like it's time to start. I was waiting for someone to say go in, and they didn't say. My name's Drick Boyd, and this is the session on disrupting whiteness. And thus far, I have really enjoyed this, this conference. I'm from just outside of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, so I'm not from the Cincinnati area, but Cincinnati, in my view, has a very rich history in anti-racist work. It was a center of the abolitionist movement, and a lot of famous abolitionists during this pre-Civil War era came from this area. So it's great to be with you. I want to talk about disrupting whiteness, and most of what I am going to be talking about comes from a book that I recently wrote called Disrupting Whiteness: How to Talk to White People About Racism. And just so you know, I'm going to talk for about 20-25 minutes, and then we'll have time for feedback and questions. And so if you have questions, you can put them in the chat, and Lexi, our proctor, will make a list, and when it's time for questions, she will go ahead and do that. So I want to begin by offering a confession. And the confession is that I am a recovering racist. And what I mean by that is that I'm a product of a family, a community, and a national culture that has led me to believe that my experience as a middle-class white American male is the norm for everyone, regardless of race or gender or sexual orientation or ethnic background. And I was raised to believe that the success I had in life was solely due to my intelligence and my hard work. And I grew up believing that the educational system, the criminal justice system, the government and other institutions in our country, while they weren't perfect, basically operated in a fair and impartial manner when it came with regard to race. And so whatever I achieved, whatever I was able to do, I believed was as a result of playing by the rules and working hard. And what I didn't realize until I got into adulthood was that the game was rigged, that I had been socialized to believe that I was a little bit smarter, a little bit more resilient than others, and I didn't realize that I had all sorts of advantages and access to resources that others didn't have. Racism was bred into me from the day I was born by loving parents, by diligent teachers, and by other caring role models, without my knowing, and probably in some cases without their knowing. I was like a child born into a drug-infested environment, and I was bound to become addicted to the drug of white superiority. Now, I called myself a recovering racist. And any of you who've been involved or know anybody who's been involved in the 12-step movement like Alcoholics Anonymous or Gamblers Anonymous know that when people complete the 12-step program, they never say they are recovered. They always say they are recovering. Because the genius of the 12-step program was that it recognizes that one is never free of addiction, but instead must continually work on their recovery. And the minute they think that they are cured or they think they are over it, that's when they begin to slide back into their addiction. And so much of my own personal journey toward an anti-racist lifestyle has involved unlearning my privilege and my limited worldview and relearning a new way of seeing and being in the world. And it involves owning the fact that sometimes I do things and say things that reveal my racist white upbringing. And sometimes I have thoughts and feelings that, even if I don't speak them, remind me daily of the ongoing work that I have to do. And so every day I have to recommit myself to the work of fighting racism in myself and in the world around me. I want to talk about disrupting whiteness, and this topic comes from a lot of places. I've often heard my friends of color colleagues of color say, you white folks got to do your own work. Don't always depend on us to educate you. And I was particularly struck by Robin DiAngelo's book, White Fragility, which I suspect many of you have read, and the subtitle, which says why it's so hard for white folks to talk about racism. And I wanted to take up that challenge as how can we talk with white folks about racism? But first, let me clarify a few terms. Often when we speak of others or we speak of ourselves as racist, we hear it as an accusation. You are racist are some of the most damning words that can be said of another person in our culture. But whenever I say I'm racist, or I say we here are racist, or our nation is racist, I'm not making an accusation. I'm making a diagnosis of our condition as white people in America. When we go to a doctor and she tells us we have an illness, or she tells us we have a malfunctioning organ in our body, we don't take that as an accusation. We're thankful because someone has been able to put their finger on what is troubling us, what is causing us struggle, what is causing us pain. It has a name. And then we can take corrective action. In the same way, when I say I'm a racist or that we're racist, the United States is a racist country, I'm diagnosing our condition, our illness. And once we accept that diagnosis, then we can begin to address it. When I use the phrase white supremacy, I'm not just referring to demeaning and discriminatory words or actions against people of color. And I'm not just talking about people who carry Nazi flags and people who invaded the Capitol a few weeks ago. Rather, I'm talking about an ideology that we have bought into and a system that we are part of, which infuses our institutions, our laws, our policies, our practices, and ways of thinking as Americans. I'm saying that we who are white are benefiting by us and advancing a system that gives us advantages that aren't always available to Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and other peoples of color. And when I talk about whiteness, I'm talking about a culture. I'm talking about a set of relational guidelines and values that determine what is generally considered to be normative in our society. And this culture tells us how we are to speak and dress, what we should value and hold to be true, and defines whose lives matter and whose practices are accepted and who and what deserves to be heard. And when we talk about systemic racism, I'm referring to those institutional structures that enforce the principles and guidelines of whiteness in our society to determine who's in and who's out, who's right and who's wrong, who's up and who's down. Now, although racism has been part of our American story since its beginning, white people have often been socialized, like I was, to believe that race really has nothing to do with them, that it's a problem for other people to address. And as a result, many white people rarely talk about race, except when it may affect them directly, such as when they might be in a setting where they are a racial minority. We who are white generally have not been socialized to think critically about race in relation to ourselves, unless we find ourselves in a situation where it's demanded of us. And we need to change this pattern. And I suspect that may be why some of you are here in this session. Robin DiAngelo talks about a concept she calls white solidarity. It's an unspoken agreement that whites won't do or say anything that will cause anyone to feel discomfort because of race. And so at family gatherings, at meet and greets, at other social settings, when someone says or does something that is overtly racist, all sorts of excuses are made for their behavior. Oh, they're really a good person. They really didn't mean that. And if someone dares to bring up the topic of racism in a social setting, very often white people will withdraw, like nothing was said, or folks will get angry that the subject has even been raised. I've actually been in such settings, all white settings, and brought up the topic of race. and have been surprised how quickly the subject changes and how angry some people can get just simply because the topic has been broached. So I want to talk about how we can begin to change this white culture and the systems that support whiteness and white solidarity. And by no means do I think I have the full and final answer, but it's rather one part of an overall strategy for addressing the complex and hideous system of white supremacy in our culture and in our institutions. Now, as we all know, on May 25th last year, Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin pushed his knee into the neck of George Floyd for 8 minutes and 46 seconds as bystanders pleaded with him to stop. And after a video of that instance went viral, people across the country began protesting in response to Floyd's unjust and unnecessary death, and other names were brought forth, like Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery and so many more. More Black people and a long line of Black people dying at the hands of police. And in cities and towns across the country, crowds were shouting, "Black Lives Matter, Black Lives Matter, Black Lives Matter." Never before in our history have so many people marched and demonstrated for racial justice. And never before in our history have so many white people marched and demonstrated for racial justice. And white people of all ages have started asking, what does it mean to work in solidarity with Black and Indigenous and other people of color for racial justice? What does it mean to be an ally or an accomplice or a co-conspirator for racial justice? Now, I want to be clear that I think that working to change the laws and policies and practices of our limitations, calling our leaders, our police, our other law enforcement personnel to account is very important. But today, I want to talk about another aspect of being a white ally or a white co-conspirator. I want to talk about another way we can be involved in anti-racist community engagement. And it's something we can all do regardless of our race, but it's something that white people are best positioned to do. And that is to engage the other white people in our networks, in our lives, our family, our friends, our coworkers, in conversations about racism in our society. You see, we need to break the taboo of white solidarity and talk with the white people in our lives about their perspectives, their feelings, and their misplaced ideas about racism in America. But before we can talk with others about racism, we have to come to terms with the way in which racism has impacted us. We need to start looking at what I like to call our race story. And one of the ways we can construct our race story is by asking ourselves a few basic questions, what I want to share with you here in the chat. And these questions are designed to get us to reflect on the impact that race and racism have had on our lives. So the first question is simply, how would you describe your race? We've all been racialized in this society. Either we've been categorized by others or we have chosen to identify ourselves racially in a particular way. For many white people, that's kind of a hard thing to do because as one of our speakers said, so often we think if we name race, that makes us racist, but that's not the case. So how would we describe your race? And the second question is, when did you become aware of race as something to be concerned about? Maybe something you saw in the news, it might be something you encountered outside of the home, something that was discussed by your parents or your teachers or other significant adults. When did you first become of race as something to be concerned about? And what was the feeling you had about it when you heard about it? In many white homes, the topic of race can be considered taboo, something not talked about at all or only in code. In other cases, it's a very common topic, but only in very overt and derogatory ways. Mm-hmm. Third question, when did you first become of your race? Now, sometimes the answer to that question is the same answer as the previous question. But for many people, especially white people, when we become aware of others' race before we begin to realize that we are racialized too. And for some, that awareness can be very unsettling. Number 4, when did you become aware of racism? For many white people, racism is something that happens to other people. In other cases, we may have grown up in an environment where racist attitudes and actions were commonly spoken. It was a part of our growing up, but because we grew up in an environment, we didn't realize that it was racist. I once had an adult student who insisted in a class that we had talking about this topic that racism was not part of her upbringing. Then later in the course, she remembered her grandfather coming home at night, taking off his white hood and his robe. And until that point, she had no idea about the racist environment in which she had been raised. Next question, when was the first time you witnessed or experienced racism? This is a question about when did racism become personal for you? No longer just an idea, but something that either you experienced or you witnessed. We may not have been the target of racism, but we may have indirectly saw or heard something that we came to understand as racist. The next question, what, if any, messages do you remember being given about race or racism by the significant adults in your life? This question allows us to reflect on the subtle and maybe not so subtle messages that significant others gave us about race. Number 7, if you know something about your family history, when were your ancestors considered white? And how did that come to be? And what were they considered before that? Because, you know, not all Europeans originally were considered white when they came to this country. Jews, Irish, Italians, Poles, and other Eastern European groups were considered something else. And only later were able to be called white. And then the last question to reflect on, which is, what are some critical incidents in your life where the reality of racism became clear to you and showed you something about yourself and the world around you that maybe you hadn't realized before? You know, think about the incidents, think about relationships, maybe courses you took, books you read, other situations that made you aware of something about yourself and made you feel something about yourself because of race and racism. It may have caused you to withdraw and become defensive. It may have caused you to change your behavior, your worldview, and your attitudes toward others. These incidents can often be very difficult to recall and very disturbing when we recall them, but they help us see the path we've traveled to get to where we are today. Now, from these questions, we can create our race story. These questions open us to consider the ways we've been shaped by the people and events in our lives and the process by which our views and attitudes about race and racism have changed over time. And you see, once we understand our race story, then we are in a position to talk with others because we are able to acknowledge that we didn't always understand things the way we understand this, that we have had uncomfortable experiences and feelings and thoughts. And it allows us to have and create a common ground with other people. As our speaker said, this is an uncomfortable work to do. And so we have to acknowledge our own experiences of discomfort and how we may have grown and changed over time. Racism is such a volatile topic for white folks that we often end up in debates with other people. And everyone sort of states their position and lays on their facts, and everybody gets a little bit worked up, and everybody gets angry, and there's blaming and shaming and arguing, and no one changes. We need a way of engaging folks that doesn't just end up in debates and arguments. We need to engage other folks, other white folks, in dialogue. for the past 10 years or so, I've been part of a group in Philadelphia that meets the first Thursday of every month called NewCore. NewCore stands for New Conversations on Race and Ethnicity. And it's an interracial, intergenerational, interfaith group that's open to any and all. And we come together to share our lives and our experiences around issues of racism. Sometimes we have just a general conversation depending on what's going on in the news. But often we have one person who's designated to share their story. And we ask them to come and talk to us about how they've come to understand themselves in terms of their racial identity. When that person is done sharing their story, we ask honest, open-ended questions that invite the storyteller to expand on and deepen their story. We don't seek to give advice. We don't ask gotcha questions. We don't ask questions that serve to bring attention to ourselves. The purpose of the questions is to draw the other person and their story out. And we focus not just on facts, but more on feelings and how they've come to think of themselves. Based on my experience with NewCore, I've developed an approach to talking with white folks about race-related issues that uses a combination of storytelling, active and empathic listening, and the use of questions that are used to draw out the story behind what a person thinks or feels. And the purpose is to invite that person into a conversation, a dialogue that's characterized by openness and respect. So how does this work? Well, I'm going to be clear that I'm not going to be able to share with you a surefire formula that I found to transform a person in one or two conversations into a committed anti-racist. Just doesn't happen. But I do want to share with you a few practices that I found, when used consistently over time, invite others to reconsider their attitudes and perspectives on race. Because we need to accept the fact that we can't change other people. We can only change ourselves, and people can only change themselves. But we can invite them into a caring, open dialogical approach that may help them reflect on why they think or believe the way they do. So the first practice is we need to be willing to bring up the topic of race and racism in all white settings. And when racist sentiments are expressed, to not remain quiet, but to respond. We need to break the temptation to remain silent and bring the topic out into the open for discussion. Second, we need to invite people to tell their story. When the topic of racism is raised, as we heard earlier today, we may encounter all sorts of different responses: denial, anger, fear, claims of colorblindness, tears, guilt, even shame. And when those responses come, I try to ask a simple question, which is, can you tell me a story of how you came to think and feel the way you do? And I try to communicate, because people are often very distrustful, that I just want to understand, that I'm not trying to trick you. I just want to understand how you came to think and feel the way you do. And then third, we listen actively and carefully with the goal of trying to understand where that person is coming from and how they got to where they are. We're not there to correct them. We're not there to criticize them. We're there to understand. And I can tell you, this is difficult because very often, deep down inside, we aren't very uncomfortable with what they're saying. But we have to work at being authentic in our desire to understand. And we ask then fourth questions that seek to draw out more of the details of that story. And as people tell their stories, often they will see things in their story that they might not have seen before. You see, talking to other people about how they think and how they feel and how they came to be often reveals to us things that we might not have otherwise seen. That's really the genius of the counseling profession. Good counselors don't give advice. More often, they just ask good, open-ended questions that cause people to reflect
on why they do what they do and why they think the way they think. And with that reflection, they begin to change. And that's the point of the questions, to help people to think through their experiences and their views. And then finally, when the opportunity arises, we tell our own story of how we grew and how we've changed in ways we thought. We don't want to be too quick to do that, but if we do so sensitively and humbly, we can help people see that we aren't putting ourselves on a pedestal, that we're not saying that we're better than them, but we're on the same journey that we're inviting them to be on. Now, more often than not, this won't all happen in one conversation, but over a series of conversations. And in so doing, we are engaging in an ongoing dialogue about racism, what it is or what it's not. And in so doing, we're engaging them in an ongoing process of understanding their own story. We know that racism is deeply embedded in our psyches, and real change occurs only over time. So this means we need to be patient and we need to be persistent. And there are a lot of emotional landmines in this process. We can get triggered if we haven't done our own work to understand how racism has and continues to work in our lives. And so as we're reaching out to our friends and our families and our co-workers on the topic of racism, often we'll find ourselves needing to go back and do some more of our own work, because these conversations can really stir up some stuff in us. Paulo Freire, a Brazilian educator who lived in the mid to late 20th century, identified 4 key factors of effective dialogue that I think are relevant to the conversation here. He said, first of all, dialogue must be profoundly loving toward the other person. Racism is such a volatile topic, it causes people to shun one another, to avoid one another, to think ill of one another. And if we want to engage folks meaningfully, we need to do so lovingly. Second, dialogue, he says, requires humility. Too often when people get a little insight or a little training in the nature of racism, they can come down pretty hard on the folks all around them as if they just don't get it. But dialogue requires humility about our own struggles with racism and the fact that we don't have it all figured out. And that's why I started my talk today with the confession that I gave, to be honest, that I don't come here as someone who's got this all figured out. Third, Freddie says, we have to have faith in the capacity of people to change themselves and to change the world around them. If we give up on the people because they're so set in our ways, we are relegating them to living and thinking in a very toxic manner. Despite the saying, old dogs can learn new tricks, and we have to have faith in that capacity. And fourth, Freire says that dialogue invites people to think critically about their lives and their perspectives and feelings on issues. By asking honest, probing questions, we are inviting them to reflect on why they think and act the way they do. I have a friend, I'll call him Ben. We grew up in the Minneapolis area, went to high school together, ran track together, even attended the same church. I wouldn't say we were the best of friends, but we knew each other casually. And about 10 years ago, I went back to a high school reunion and we reconnected and had a long conversation, and we continued to communicate. And I have a regular blog that I write, and around the time of George Floyd's death, I wrote a pretty strong statement about the history of police violence and the underlying racism fueling that violence. And Ben took great offense to that. When he came at me, my first inclination was to get into fight mode, to debate, to lay on the facts. But instead, I stopped myself and I asked, tell me why you're feeling so strongly. What's going on? And it turned out that one of his adult children lived near the area where all the marches and demonstrations were taking place in Minneapolis. And he was really scared for his son. And the more I talked with him, I began to realize that Ben had a lot of fears around the issue of race.
And so off and on, we've continued to communicate. And there are times when Ben said he's just going to write me off, but I continue to reach out and he keeps responding. I share that story because number one, it highlights that what I'm sharing is not a simple formula for success. And number two, that doing this work is not a one and done deal. And number three, it requires a commitment to hang in there with those white people in our lives who got issues around racism. Talking about race and racism brings up all sorts of feelings in white folks. So to do this work, we need to be able to articulate our stories. We need to be willing to bring the topic of racism up and respond to it in constructive ways. We need to engage in dialogue, not debate, inviting others to tell their stories and probing those stories with honest, open, empathic questions that help us understand where they're coming from. We need to realize that the people we reach out to are all a work in progress, and that we're inviting others on a path toward transformation and openness that we ourselves are on. And finally, we must be patient and persistent in this process, realizing that racism is deeply embedded in our souls and in our institutions, in our culture, and that change takes time. You know, people who study population trends have said that for people in America, especially white people in America, the year 2042, 21 years from now, is going to be a pivotal year. If current trends continue, sometime in that year, a baby will be born who's Black or Latino or Native American or of Asian background. And about the same time, a white person is going to die. And when that happens, white people will comprise less than 50% of the US population. Demographers project that by the year 2050, Latinx folks will comprise about 30% of the population, Asian Americans about 9%, Blacks somewhere around 14%, and whites 46%. As we learned earlier today, that's already happened in some states, but it'll happen across the country by 2050. And already we've seen militant white nationalist groups act up in response to what they feel is their falling status and power in our nation. And that fear will only continue unless we start reaching out to the white people in our lives, in our society, and help them come to terms with the fact that we can live in a society where all people are valued, all people are respected, all people are included equitably, regardless of their race and ethnicity. What we're talking about when we talk about disrupting whiteness and white supremacy in our society is not only a good thing to do and a right thing to do, it's a necessary thing to do. It's vital to our health and our security and our future as a nation. Thank you for being here, and I'm willing to entertain any questions or comments that anybody would have in the time we have left. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Boyd. If anyone has any questions or comments they want to put in the chat, I can relay that information. We have about 3 minutes left together.
Someone asked about the 4 ideas on dialogue. The author is Paulo Freire, F-R-E-I-R-E, and his most famous book is a book called Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and he does have a chapter in that book on dialogue, but he also talks about dialogue in a number of his books. But I would start with Pedagogy of the Oppressed.
Kelly asked, what do you recommend is a good response when a talk with someone goes sour?
I can confess I have a lot of experience with that, Kelly. I think, you know, there comes a point in these kind of conversations when you realize, okay, we've done as much as we can do. And I don't think it's helpful to press something if you have a sense that this is not going
in a positive direction. In fact, maybe going in a direction that drives you further apart. And so, you know, at that point, what I usually do is I simply say, you know, I understand we're not understanding each other here. And maybe we come back to it. I mean, this is why I think working within our existing networks is really helpful. Number one, because that gives us a chance to go back and forth. And my experience has been there's a lot of back and forth in this. And the other thing is the power of our relationship itself can make a significant difference. I mean, let's say you're talking to a parent, or you're talking to a sibling, or you're talking to, as I was with Ben, a good friend from high school. There's prior history there. It can hold that relationship, and so you can come back to it. And if my experience with people like Ben are any indication, he knows I care about him, even though he can't stand some of the things I believe. And so he's willing to respond. And, you know, I think the fact that he gets angry at me, even though I don't like it, is a sign that he cares. Because if he really didn't care, he'd just write me off. He'd just go away. So I think, you have to, it takes some sensitivity, but I would just realize, okay, I've done as much as I can today. But that's a great question.
There's another question that kind of tied in to the last thing that was asked, which is there a point when it becomes unproductive and not worth our energy? I'm not sure when they're going to pull us back, but if you just want to keep answering, or if you want to.
Yeah, I think this moment right now, post January 6th, is one of those times when it's really hard. I reached out to Ben and a couple other people who I know were very conservative, and I simply asked the question, could you help me understand how you interpreted January 6th? And they just were not able to engage that question. And so I think this is, sometimes you just have to realize, okay, I went back to them and repeated the question again. And in all three cases, I probably talked with them 3 times each. They still haven't answered, but doesn't mean I won't keep asking and approaching. But this is a tough time because of the heightened polarities we're dealing with. Thank you all for choosing to be here, and blessings to you all in your continued anti-racist work. It's been great.